He came back silent, not quiet in the way a man is quiet after a long day, or tired in the way sleep can fix, but silent in the way a house is silent after something terrible has happened inside it. The kind of silence that has weight, that presses against the walls, that makes the air feel different when you walk through it. Whatever he saw out there on that frozen ridge in the winter of 1908, it left 24 documented observations in the official record of Harlan County, Kentucky. And not one of them has ever been satisfactorily explained. If you're watching this late at night or early in the morning before the rest of your house is awake, go ahead and drop a comment. Tell us where you are and what time it is. You're not alone in this. To understand what happened to Elias Cord, you have to first understand what Harlan County was in 1908. Not the mythology, not the Cold Wars that would come later in the 1930s, when labor and capital would tear the region apart with rifle fire and newspaper headlines. In 1908, that reckoning was still a generation away. What Harlan County was, in the winter of that year, was something older and quieter, and in many ways more complicated. A place still negotiating its own identity, caught between the 19th century it had grown from and the 20th century it had not yet learned to inhabit. The county seat, the town of Harlan itself, sat at the confluence of two branches of the Cumberland River, surrounded on all sides by mountain ridges that in December turned slate gray and brown, their timber stripped by the sawmill operations that had been working the hollow since the 1890s. The town had a post office, two churches, one Baptist, one Methodist, a general store run by a man named Arthur Pell, a one-room schoolhouse that doubled as a civic meeting hall, and a population of approximately 840 souls, according to the 1900 census, a number that had grown only slightly in the 8 years since. It was not a prosperous town, but it was not a desperate one either. Not yet. The coal underneath the mountains had been known about for decades, but the infrastructure to extract it at scale, the railroads, the financing, the outside labor, had not yet fully arrived. What had arrived was the promise of it, the rumor of it, the economic anticipation that had already begun to change the social fabric of the county in ways that most residents could feel, but not articulate. Land was being surveyed. Mineral rights were being quietly purchased by men from Cincinnati and Louisville, who arrived in town, asked careful questions, and left without explaining themselves. Into this world, Elias Cord fit like a man who had always belonged there. He was 31 years old in December of 1908. He had been born in the county, in a small settlement called Brownie's Fork, about 9 miles east of the town, the third son of a subsistence farmer named Jedediah Cord. His mother, Alma, had died when he was 11. His father had died when he was 22. His two older brothers had moved on, one to Knoxville, one to parts unknown, and Elias had stayed. He had stayed and he had worked, picking up whatever work the county offered. Timber contracts, occasional surveying assistance for the county land office, hunting and trapping in the winter months, farm labor in the summer. He was, by all accounts, an unremarkable man in the most generous sense of that phrase. People who knew him described him consistently as quiet, competent, and reliable. The word steady appears in at least 3 separate recollections that survive in the county historical record. His neighbor Dora Markham, whose family lived about 2 miles from the small cabin Elias had built for himself near the eastern branch of the Cumberland, described him years later as a man who kept his word and didn't ask for more than he needed. The postmaster, Calvin Sturgill, remembered him as someone who collected his mail punctually, paid his bills without complaint, and never lingered to gossip. He had, so far as anyone knew, no enemies. No outstanding debts of significance, no romantic entanglements that anyone was aware of. He attended church occasionally, but not devoutly. He drank, but not to excess. He was, in the vocabulary of the time and place, a good neighbor, which is why, in December of 1908, when the county land office hired him as a surveying assistant for a project in the higher ridges east of town, nobody gave it a second thought. The project was straightforward. A land company out of Cincinnati, the Appalachian Land and Mineral Trust, had purchased approximately 600 acres of ridgetop property from 3 separate families over the previous 18 months. Before they could file complete title documentation with the state, they needed an accurate boundary survey of the combined parcel. The county surveyor, a man named Benjamin Watts, was responsible for overseeing the work. He contracted Elias Cord as a field assistant, along with a younger man named Percy Hamlin, who was 17 and the son of one of the families that had sold their land to the trust. The survey was scheduled to take 3 days. They would climb to the ridge on the first morning, establish base points, run lines through the second day, and descend on the third. Benjamin Watts was experienced. Elias Cord knew the terrain. Percy Hamlin was young and eager and had never done survey work before, but he was strong and the county couldn't afford to pay a third professional. They left on the morning of December 8, 1908. It was cold. Several witnesses later remembered that the temperature that morning was well below freezing, and that there had been a light snowfall the night before that had dusted the upper ridges with about 2 inches of powder. The men were dressed appropriately. They carried food for 3 days, survey equipment, and the basic tools that ridge work required: rope, hatchets, marking stakes, a compass, a chain for measuring distances. They were seen leaving town by at least 4 people whose accounts are consistent. Arthur Pell, the general store owner, saw them purchase some additional rope and a small tin of kerosene. Calvin Sturgill saw them walking east on the main road, Elias in front, Benjamin Watts beside him, Percy Hamlin carrying the heaviest equipment on his back and looking, the postmaster noted, somewhat nervous. A woman named Grace Tipton, who was hanging laundry in her yard near the edge of town, remembered watching them pass and thinking that the sky to the east looked heavy, like more snow was considering coming. The 4th witness was a child, a boy of about 9 named Harmon Ledford, who was sitting on a fence post near the edge of his family's property and who later told his mother that he had watched the 3 men walk until they were out of sight. He said that the tall one, which would have been Elias Cord, who was described as standing about 6 feet, had turned around once and looked back at the town, just for a moment, then turned back and kept walking. This detail is small. It may mean nothing, but it was remembered, and it was recorded. And it is the kind of detail that, once you know the rest of the story, takes on a quality that is difficult to name. For the first 2 days, nothing unusual appears to have happened. There are no contemporary accounts of this naturally. The men were on a ridge 9 miles from the nearest settlement, doing survey work in cold weather, and nobody was watching them. What we have instead are the retrospective accounts of Benjamin Watts and Percy Hamlin, both of whom returned on the evening of December 10th, the 3rd day as planned, and both of whom were, by all accounts, in normal physical condition. What was not normal was that they came back alone. Benjamin Watts reported immediately to the county sheriff, a man named George Prewitt, whose office was adjacent to the courthouse in the center of town. The account Watts gave that evening is recorded in Sheriff Prewitt's own hand, in a ledger that still exists in the Kentucky Department for Libraries and Archives in Frankfort. It is one of the primary documents in this case, and it is worth dwelling on for a moment because it is remarkable not for what it says, but for what it very carefully doesn't say. Benjamin Watts told the sheriff that on the morning of December 10th, the final day of the survey, the 3 men had risen before dawn to break camp and complete their last set of measurements before beginning the descent. Watts and Hamlin had worked the northern boundary line while Cord had walked south along the ridge to establish a final reference point approximately 300 yards from camp. This was apparently routine. Cord knew the terrain better than either of them, and the southern section of the ridge was straightforward, a narrow spine of exposed rock that required nothing more than a compass reading and a stake placement. He had not come back. Watts had waited 2 hours. Then he and Hamlin had walked the southern line themselves, found the stake that Cord had placed, found it correctly positioned, surveyed with evident competence, and found no other sign of him. No footprints beyond a certain point, though by mid-morning the wind had been strong enough to have obscured lighter impressions in the light snow. No dropped equipment, No sign of a fall or injury. Watts had spent the afternoon searching the immediate area with Hamlin. Then, as the light began to fail and the temperature to drop, he made the decision that many men in his position would have made. He chose to descend and report rather than risk losing 2 more men to nightfall on an exposed ridge in December. He told the sheriff all of this. His account was measured and detailed and consistent with everything that subsequent investigators confirmed. He was clearly shaken, but he was functioning. He answered questions directly. He did not speculate. What he did not do, and this is the first of the 24 things that has never been explained, was say anything at all about what Elias Cord had been like during those 3 days on the ridge. Not one word. The sheriff's notes show a complete account of logistics, movements, and timeline. There is no record of Benjamin Watts being asked how Cord had seemed. No record of any observation about his behavior, his mood, or his state of mind during those final days. The sheriff apparently did not ask, and Watts apparently did not volunteer. This might mean nothing. A man was missing. The practical facts were what mattered. In 1908, in a small Kentucky county with limited resources and the beginning of winter coming on fast, there was no protocol for what we might now call a wellness assessment of a missing person's recent behavior. The sheriff needed to know where to look. Watts told him what he could. But years later, when Watts was an old man and a historian from the University of Kentucky named Dr. Margaret Faircloth interviewed him as part of a broader oral history project about rural Appalachian life, she asked him about the Cord case specifically. By then it was 1939, and Elias Cord was still alive, and what had happened to him in those 3 days on the ridge, and in the years that followed, had become a kind of local legend, the kind of story that gets told quietly, in specific company, with the windows closed. Watts was 81 years old when Faircloth interviewed him. He was, by her account, a careful and intelligent man, still sharp, still precise in his language. She asked him directly whether anything unusual had happened on the ridge before Cord disappeared. There was a long pause. She noted it explicitly in her transcription, marking it as lasting several seconds. And then Watts said, very slowly, he changed on the second night. I don't know what he saw, but something on that ridge got into him, and after that second night he wasn't the same man who walked up with us. Faircloth asked him to explain what he meant by changed. Watts said, he stopped sleeping. He'd just sit there by the fire, not looking at it, looking out past it, into the dark. Percy asked him once what he was watching for, and Elias looked at the boy like he was angry, the only time I ever saw anger in him. And then he went back to looking at the dark. That is all Watts said. Faircloth pressed him several times for more detail, and he refused to provide it. Not with agitation or defensiveness, but with the quiet firmness of a man who has decided, over many decades, that some things are better left where they are. The search for Elias Cord began on December 11th, 1908, the morning after Watts and Hamlin returned. Sheriff Prewitt organized a party of 9 men, himself, a deputy, Watts, and 6 volunteers from the town, and they ascended the eastern ridge by mid-morning. The conditions were difficult. Overnight, fresh snow had fallen, perhaps 4 inches of it, covering whatever tracks the original survey party might have left. The temperature was in the low 20s. They searched for 2 days. They found nothing. No trace of a body, no sign of a fall into one of the hollows below the ridgeline. No discarded equipment, no blood, no evidence of animal predation. On the second day of the search, Percy Hamlin, who had insisted on returning despite his youth, reportedly became distressed and had to be helped down the slope by one of the other men. His distress was attributed at the time to exhaustion and cold. He did not elaborate on it, and no one pushed him to. On December 14th, the search was formally suspended due to deteriorating weather. The official notation in the county records reads, "Search for Elias Cord, missing deck. 10/1908, suspended deck tomorrow, 14 pending improved conditions. Fate unknown." Below this, in slightly different ink that suggests it was added later, is a single additional line. Subject located deck on 23/1908, see supplemental file. The supplemental file, if it ever existed as a separate document, has been lost. What remains is the notation itself and the other records that were generated in the weeks and months after Cord's return, which is collectively what historians and investigators have been working from ever since, because Elias Cord did return. On the morning of December 23rd, 1908, 13 days after he had walked to the southern edge of the ridge and not come back, he walked into Harlan, Kentucky, alone, on foot, in weather that had been consistently brutal, and presented himself at the door of Arthur Pell's general store shortly after 7 o'clock in the morning. Arthur Pell opened his door to find Elias Cord standing on his porch. Pell's own account of this moment, given to a local newspaper in 1912 when a reporter wrote a brief item about the case, is one of the most carefully observed pieces of testimony in the entire record. "I didn't recognize him right away," Pell said. "He was standing in the same place I'd seen him 100 times, wearing the same coat he'd left in, and for a moment I couldn't figure out who it was. Then I realized it was Elias, and I got a feeling I don't have a good word for. Not fear exactly. Something more like wrongness. Like looking at a familiar room and knowing something in it has been moved, but not being able to find what. He was not frostbitten. He was not starving. He did not appear to have suffered any obvious physical injury. He was thin, visibly thinner than he had been 2 weeks earlier, which was consistent with limited food over 13 days. And he was dirty, and his coat was torn in several places. But he was standing upright, on his own power, breathing regularly. His eyes were open. He did not speak. Pell ushered him inside. He sat him by the stove. He sent his shop boy to fetch the sheriff, and after a moment's consideration, also the county's sole physician, a doctor named Howard Tate, who maintained a small office on the second floor of the courthouse building. For approximately 40 minutes, while Pell waited for help to arrive, Elias Cord sat beside the wood stove in the general store and said nothing. Pell later described him as present but not present. His eyes were open and he was looking around, but he wasn't seeing what was there. He was seeing something else, something he'd brought back with him. Pell asked him several times if he was hurt. No response. Asked him if he was hungry. No response. He brought Cord a cup of hot coffee and put it in his hands, and Cord held it for the entire 40 minutes until the sheriff arrived, but never drank from it. The coffee was cold when the doctor checked it later. When Sheriff Prewitt arrived, he attempted to question Cord immediately. Cord looked at him, not through him, at him. There was recognition in his face. People later agreed on this. He knew where he was. He knew who these men were, and he did not speak to them. This silence lasted for 9 days. Dr. Howard Tate examined Elias Cord on December 23rd, 24th, and again on January 1st, 1909. His medical notes from these examinations, which are preserved in a collection donated to the Harlan County Historical Society in 1947 by his daughter, are among the most fascinating documents in the case. Not because they explain anything, but because they document, in the careful neutral language of an early 20th century general practitioner, a series of observations that Tate himself clearly found bewildering. The physical examination on December 23rd showed a man in relatively sound health given his circumstances. Weight loss consistent with approximately 12 to 14 days of significantly reduced caloric intake. Minor abrasions on both hands. A healed cut above his left eyebrow, healed, not fresh, which was odd because it had not been there when he left town, that Tate estimated was 4 to 7 days old. Core temperature slightly below normal, but not critically so. No evidence of frostbite on extremities, no broken bones. Heartbeat regular, if somewhat slow. The neurological observations are more complicated. Tate wrote that Cord showed a complete and apparently voluntary cessation of verbal communication, but that this was not accompanied by any of the signs Tate associated with the brain injuries or strokes he had seen in his practice. His grip strength was normal. His reflexes were normal. When asked to perform simple physical tasks, stand, sit, walk to the window, he complied without hesitation. He appeared to understand spoken language. He could follow instructions. He simply would not speak. Tate's second entry, from December 24th, contains a detail that he does not interpret, but that he clearly found significant enough to record. He wrote, Patient has been observed by Mrs. Prewitt, who has been attending him at the sheriff's residence, to be writing. Mrs. Prewitt reports that during the night of December 23rd, she heard a sound from the room where Cord was sleeping, and looking in, found him sitting upright in the bed, writing in rapid and apparently agitated motions with his right hand, but upon a blank surface, with no implement. When she spoke to him, he stopped immediately and lay back down. He appeared to be asleep within minutes. In the morning, he had no apparent recollection of the episode. Tate's note here reads, "This is consistent with a somnambulistic episode, possibly the first of several. I am inclined to attribute it to accumulated nervous stress and disrupted sleep." However, I note that the motion Mrs. Prewitt described was not random. She said it looked like he was writing words, in lines, from left to right, as a person writes a letter. This is the second of the 24 things that has never been explained. What was Elias Cord writing, in the dark, with no pen, on a blank surface while apparently asleep? He never said. When he finally began to speak again, on January 1st, 1909, New Year's Day, 9 days after his return, the first thing he said was an apology, not for disappearing, not for the trouble he had caused. He looked at Sheriff Prewitt, who had been sitting in the room with him that morning, and he said quietly and clearly, "I'm sorry I made you come up there." Prewitt told him he was glad he was safe. He asked him what had happened. Cord looked at the window for a long time. Then he said, "I need some time." He was given time. He returned to his cabin. He resumed within a few weeks, something approaching his normal life. He did his work. He collected his mail. He paid his bills. But he was not the same. The changes in Elias Cord after his return were catalogued over time by a remarkable number of people, not because anyone was conducting a formal investigation, but because he lived in a small community where people paid attention to each other, and because what had happened to him was strange enough that those around him kept watching, kept noticing, and, eventually, kept writing things down. The first and most consistent change was the one Benjamin Watts had first observed on the ridge. Cord had difficulty sleeping, not the ordinary insomnia of a stressed or worried man, something more specific, and to those who witnessed it, more unsettling. He would sleep for a few hours in the early part of the night and then simply stop sleeping, not lie awake. Stop sleeping in the way you stop doing something you've decided not to do. He would rise, regardless of the hour or the weather, and go outside and sit on the small porch of his cabin, facing east, facing the ridge. Dora Markham, his nearest neighbor, mentioned this several times in conversations over the following years. She had a habit of rising early, before dawn, to tend to her animals, and she said that it was unusual, in the years after Cord came back, to look across the hollow and not see the small orange glow of his pipe on his porch in the dark. She asked him once, with neighborly directness, whether he was sleeping all right. He told her he slept fine. She knew this was not true, but she did not push it. The second change was more difficult to describe and was articulated differently by different people, but the core observation was consistent. Something had happened to his attention. Before the ridge, Cord had been described as a focused and present man, someone who listened when you spoke and who engaged with his surroundings. After the ridge, there was a quality to his attention that people struggled to name. He was still present, in the physical sense. He still responded to questions and performed his work adequately, but there was a part of him that was consistently elsewhere, a portion of his attention that was perpetually occupied with something no one else could see. The third change, which emerged over the months following his return and which persisted in varying degrees for the rest of his life, was what might be described as a profound and specific avoidance of certain places, times, and conditions. He would not go above a certain elevation. He would not be in the open after dark if it could be helped. He would not, under any circumstances that anyone ever observed, go near the eastern ridge, the ridge where he had disappeared, the ridge whose upper edges were visible on clear days from the center of town. This was noticed. It could not have been otherwise. In a community where many men spent portions of their lives in the hills, Hunting, trapping, timber work, a man who would not go above 800 feet was conspicuous. He declined survey work. He declined hunting invitations. When a timber contract that would have paid him well required access to the upper slopes, he turned it down without explanation and accepted lesser-paying work in the bottomland instead. People understood that something had happened to him up there. They respected the boundary in the way that rural communities of that era often respected the private wounds of their neighbors, not by ignoring them, but by not requiring them to be explained. Nobody pushed Elias Cord to talk about what had happened on the ridge, and for nearly 4 years, he didn't. The testimonies that were eventually gathered, some in the years immediately following the event, some decades later by researchers and historians, paint a picture that is both deeply human and persistently strange. Percy Hamlin, the 17-year-old who had been the third member of the survey party, left Harlan County in 1910 and moved to Cincinnati, where he found work in a factory. He married. He had children. He lived a long and apparently ordinary life. In 1934, a journalist named Carl Eberhardt, who was working on a broader piece about the folklore of rural Kentucky for a Chicago magazine, tracked Hamlin down and interviewed him. Hamlin was 43 years old by then, a stocky, cautious man who, by Eberhardt's description, chose his words with the care of someone who had learned that some words, once out, cannot be taken back. Hamlin confirmed the basic outline of the story. He confirmed that Cord had changed on the second night, that something had happened that neither he nor Watts had fully explained in the official account. But when pressed, he offered something that no previous account had included. He said that on the afternoon of December 9th, the second day on the ridge, the day before Cord disappeared, all 3 men had observed something in the hollow below the southern slope. He described it as a light, not fire. He was specific about this. Not the warm, flickering orange of a campfire or lantern, but something cooler, more diffuse that seemed to move without being wind-driven. He said it was visible for perhaps 20 minutes in the late afternoon before the light failed completely. He said that Benjamin Watts had attributed it immediately and confidently to reflection from ice, or perhaps from the windows of a farmhouse in the valley below. He said this explanation had satisfied both Watts and himself. He said it had not satisfied Elias Cord. Cord had stood and watched that light for the entire 20 minutes. When it faded, he had stayed at the edge of the ridge looking into the hollow for another half hour, saying nothing. When Hamlin had gone to him and touched his arm, Cord had turned, and his face had been— Hamlin searched for a word, and then said with apparent reluctance, transformed. Not afraid, not excited. Something that Hamlin, after 26 years of trying to find the right word for it, could only describe as recognized. Like he knew what it was, Hamlin told the journalist. Like whatever was down in that hollow, he knew it, and it knew him back. This is the third of the 24 things. The light in the hollow, seen by 3 men, attributed by 2 of them to ordinary natural causes, and responded to by the third in a way that cannot be accounted for by ice or window glass. What was the light? The hollow below the southern ridge in December of 1908 was sparsely inhabited. 1 family, the Ledmores, in a farmhouse about a mile below the ridgeline. The Ledmore family was interviewed by Sheriff Prewitt after Cord's return. They reported nothing unusual. They had not had their lanterns near the windows on the afternoon of December 9th. They had seen no other lights in the area. Benjamin Watts, when asked about this in the 1939 oral history interview, acknowledged the light but maintained his original explanation. He said he had been quite certain it was reflected light from ice on the hollow floor. He said this with the particular certainty of a man who has been quite certain of something for a very long time, and who is unwilling, at 81, to be uncertain about it now. In the spring of 1912, Elias Cord came as close as he ever came to explaining himself. The occasion was not a formal interview or a public statement. It was a conversation, several conversations actually, spread over the course of about 3 weeks, with a young Methodist minister named Reverend James Alcott, who had arrived in Harlan County in early 1912 to take over the congregation of the Methodist Church there. Alcott was 28 years old, a graduate of a theological college in Nashville, a man of genuine intellectual curiosity who had, by his own later account, been intrigued by the Cord story from the moment he arrived in the county and heard it in the natural course of getting to know his congregation. Alcott had the advantage of being new. He had not been in Harlan in 1908. He had no investment in any particular version of the story. And he had the advantage of the cloth. People in that community spoke to their minister about things they would not speak about to neighbors, relatives, or officials. The confessional impulse, even among Protestants, has its own gravity. He approached Cord carefully over time without pressure. He visited the cabin on the pretext of pastoral calling. He sat on the porch. He talked about other things: the weather, the state of the county roads, the question of whether the incoming coal companies would bring prosperity or its opposite. He let Cord be quiet when Cord wanted to be quiet. After several visits, Cord spoke. Alcott wrote down what Cord told him, but not immediately. He waited until 1924, when he was living in Louisville and serving a larger congregation there, and wrote it as part of a longer unpublished memoir about his years in rural ministry. The memoir was never published. A copy of it, a typed manuscript of some 200 pages, was donated to the Louisville Theological Seminary Library by Alcott's son in 1963. Dr. Margaret Faircloth, the same historian who had interviewed Benjamin Watts in 1939, found it in 1961 and spent considerable time with it. She produced a 20-page analysis that was published in the Kentucky Folklore Record in 1962, which is where most researchers have gotten their information about Alcott's account. What Cord told Alcott, as filtered through Alcott's own prose and interpretive lens, is this. On the morning of December 10th, after a second night without sleep, Cord had walked south along the ridge to place the final survey stake. The walk was perhaps a third of a mile. The ridge at its southern end narrowed to a spine of exposed limestone about 12 feet wide, with steep slopes dropping away on both sides. He placed the stake correctly. He made his compass notations, and then he heard something in the hollow below. He could not describe the sound precisely, or perhaps was not willing to. Alcott's paraphrase reads, "He said it was not an animal sound and not a human sound and not a mechanical sound. He said it was more like a tone than a sound, if that distinction can be understood. A sustained note produced by something he had no framework to explain. He said it came from the same direction as the light he had seen the previous afternoon. He climbed down the slope. This much is confirmed by the physical evidence. The searchers who came up the ridge after his return found signs of descent on the southern slope that Watts's party had missed in the initial search. He climbed down into the hollow. He would not say what he found there." Alcott writes, "This is where Elias became, in the space of a single sentence, a different kind of witness. He said, with a clarity I had not heard from him before or after, 'I saw 24 things down in that hollow, Reverend, and I am not going to describe any of them to you, because the describing of them would do the same thing to you that the seeing of them did to me, and I would not do that to any man.'" Alcott pressed him gently over subsequent visits. Cord did not elaborate on the 24 observations themselves. He was willing to speak about their effects. He said they had taken something from him, not in a dramatic way, not in the way a robbery takes something, but in the slow, structural way that a prolonged cold takes the heat from a room. He said that what he had seen had rewritten something in the architecture of his understanding, and that the rewriting had left him unable to entirely inhabit the world the way he had before. He said that for the 13 days he had been missing, he had been in the hollow. He did not fully account for those 13 days. He said the time had not passed the way time normally passes. He said he had been fed. He used this word deliberately, though he could not or would not explain by whom or what. He said that when he finally came out of the hollow and walked back to town, he had brought the 24 things with him, not as objects, as knowledge, as a kind of cargo that he was condemned to carry for the rest of his life without being able to set it down or pass it to someone else. Alcott asked him if he was afraid. Cord thought about this for a long time. Then he said, "No, Fear was one of the things that went away when I went down into that hollow. I've missed it since. Fear keeps a man properly related to the world. Without it, everything feels at the same distance. Nothing feels close enough to matter the right amount. The official record contains, scattered across its various documents, a further 21 specific observations about Elias Cord's behavior and condition in the years following his return. Together with the two already described, the night writing with no pen and the light in the hollow, they constitute what researchers have come to call the 24, though the exact composition of this list has been subject to significant scholarly disagreement, since Cord himself never enumerated them, and the number is drawn from his own statement to Alcott rather than from any official taxonomy. Several are relatively minor. He stopped using his left hand almost entirely after his return. He had been ambidextrous before. The reason was never explained. He began, in the years after 1909, to exhibit an unusual sensitivity to changes in barometric pressure. He could predict storms with a consistency that his neighbors noted and commented on repeatedly before any visible meteorological sign. He would become agitated and withdrawn in the hours before a significant weather change. He was right, it appears, nearly every time. He began keeping detailed written records of something, though what exactly is unknown. His cabin was broken into once in 1915 by a young man attempting a theft, and the thief later described, in a confession to the sheriff that covered several other crimes, having found the cabin full of papers, written on both sides, covering what appeared to be a single continuous notation that ran through hundreds of sheets. He described the handwriting as very small and very regular, and said that none of the pages had dates, and that he could not read most of what was written, because the language, if it was language, was one he did not recognize. When the sheriff subsequently visited Cord about the break-in, he noted the papers but did not examine them. Cord told him they were work records. The sheriff, who by 1915 was a different man, Prewitt had retired, did not pursue the matter. Cord continued to write, as far as can be determined, until the end of his life. When he died in 1941, of natural causes, at the age of 64, which was not an unremarkable lifespan for a man of his circumstances and era, his cabin was found to contain no papers at all, none. The cabin was otherwise as he had left it, orderly and sparse, but the papers, whatever they contained, whatever he had been writing in that small, careful hand for 33 years, were gone. Dr. D.R. Howard Tate, who had examined Cord in December of 1908 and who continued to serve as the county physician for many years, became increasingly interested in the case as he grew older. He was not a man given to mystical or supernatural explanation. His correspondence, when it touches on the Cord case, is consistently medical and analytical in its framing. But he was honest enough to acknowledge, in a letter written to a colleague at the University of Kentucky in 1921, that Cord's case had challenged him in ways that his medical training had not prepared him for. The letter is worth quoting at modest length, within appropriate limits. Tate describes examining Cord again in 1919, a decade after the initial events, for an unrelated respiratory complaint. He writes that the physical examination had been ordinary in most respects, but that he had noticed something that had struck him at the time and continued to strike him afterward. He writes, "The man's eyes have changed. I know this sounds like the observation of a novelist rather than a physician, but I'm attempting to be precise. I examined his eyes professionally, and there is nothing clinically anomalous about them. But there is a quality to the way he uses them that I have not seen in another patient in 30 years of practice. He does not look at things the way the rest of us do. He looks at things as though he can see something in them, or behind them, or through them, that we cannot. When I moved my lamp to examine his throat, he tracked the light with his eyes in a way that seemed, if I am honest, like something I have only seen in very young children, before they've learned to take the ordinary world for granted." Tate ends this letter by saying that he does not know what happened to Elias Cord on that ridge, and that he suspects he never will. He says, "There are events in a life that exceed the capacity of available explanation, and the honest response to them is not to produce an inadequate explanation, but to acknowledge that the capacity itself is the limitation." This is, in some ways, the most intellectually honest statement in the entire record. The theories that have been advanced over the decades to explain the Cord case span a considerable range. At one end of the spectrum, the most conservative explanations focus on psychological trauma and dissociation. The proposal is straightforward, that something happened on that ridge: a fall, an injury, an encounter with another person, an accidental consumption of contaminated food or water that produced a severe traumatic response, a dissociative episode of the kind that was not well understood in 1908 and would not be systematically studied for several more decades. Under this theory, the 13 missing days were spent in a kind of fugue state, during which Cord survived by instinct and returned to consciousness only gradually. The changes in his subsequent behavior would reflect the lasting neurological and psychological impact of this trauma. This is the explanation that most academic historians favor, and it is not without merit. The early 20th century had no framework for what we might now call post-traumatic stress, but the condition itself was clearly present in the lives of people who experienced extreme events. Cord's subsequent insomnia, his hypervigilance, his avoidance of the ridge and the conditions associated with his disappearance, all of these are consistent with a trauma response, and all of them are consistent with what we now know about how severe psychological events can permanently reorganize a person's relationship with the world. But this theory has a stubborn problem, which is the 24 observations, not the ones Cord mentioned to Alcott, the things he saw in the hollow, but the 24 documented behavioral and perceptual changes that the people around him recorded over the years. A trauma response accounts for the insomnia, the withdrawal, the elevation avoidance. It does not easily account for the barometric sensitivity or the phantom writing, or the 33 years of inexplicable papers, or the eyes that a careful and skeptical physician described as looking through the ordinary surface of things into something beyond it. A second category of explanation focuses on the possibility of an encounter with another person or persons in that hollow. In 1908, the eastern ridges of Harlan County were not entirely uninhabited. There were hermits in the colloquial sense, men who had withdrawn from ordinary community life for various reasons, who lived in isolated hollows, who were rarely seen and rarely discussed. It has been suggested that Cord encountered such an individual or group, that he was held, willingly or otherwise, for the 13 days, and that what he referred to as 24 things were observations about this person or group and their way of living that were so alien to his experience as to constitute a form of knowledge shock, an encounter with a mode of being so different from his own that it rewired his understanding of what the world could contain. This is a more interesting theory in some ways, but it founders on the physical evidence. Cord did not appear abused or restrained. He showed no signs of having been bound or confined. He was malnourished, but not catastrophically so. More importantly, the people who knew him best, people who were good at reading a man, as people in close communities tend to be, consistently described his silence not as the silence of a traumatized captive, but as something more active, something chosen. The third explanation, and the one that is least often advanced in formal academic contexts, but the one that persists most stubbornly in the informal record, in the family stories and the passed-down memories of people who actually knew Elias Cord, is the one that is hardest to name without reaching for language that sounds either religious or supernatural, and which therefore tends to get dismissed before it can be properly examined. This explanation does not require anything impossible. It does not require anything that violates the known laws of physics or biology or psychology. It requires only the following: that whatever Elias Cord encountered in that hollow on December 10th, 1908, was real, was physically real, was actually present in the world, and was something that the conceptual vocabulary available to Harlan County in 1908 was simply not equipped to describe or contain. Not supernatural, not divine, not monstrous, simply other in the most literal sense, belonging to a category of reality that the culture and education of the time had not prepared anyone to name or document or investigate. Under this theory, the 24 things Cord saw were observations of something genuine, something documentable in principle, something that a different kind of observer with different tools might have been able to analyze. And Cord's silence was not the silence of the traumatized or the evasive, but the silence of the person who has seen something that language, as currently constituted, is genuinely inadequate to convey. The describing of them would do the same thing to you that the seeing of them did to me. This is what he told Alcott. This is not the statement of a man who cannot explain what he saw. It is the statement of a man who has decided, deliberately and carefully, that explanation in this instance is a form of damage. In 1927, a professor of psychology from the University of Kentucky named Dr. Victor Ansted spent 3 days in Harlan County as part of a broader study of what he called crisis residue, the lasting psychological and behavioral changes in individuals who had survived extreme situations. He had studied miners who had survived collapses, soldiers who had returned from the war in Europe, a woman in eastern Tennessee who had survived a flood that had killed her entire family. He had published a small monograph on the subject in 1925 that had attracted modest academic attention. He had read about the Cord case in a footnote in a regional history, and he had come to see if there was material there for his research. He spoke with Cord twice. He also spoke with Dora Markham, Calvin Sturgill, who was still the postmaster, and Dr. Tate. He reviewed the sheriff's records and Tate's medical notes. At the end of his 3 days, he sat in the county courthouse and wrote 7 pages of notes that were later filed with his papers at the university, where they remain accessible to researchers. His clinical assessment of Cord was detailed and, by the standards of 1927 psychology, sophisticated. He identified what he called a fixed perceptual alteration, a lasting change in how Cord processed sensory information that had resulted in what Ansted somewhat cautiously called an expanded registration of environmental data, by which he meant that Cord appeared to be noticing and responding to aspects of his physical environment that ordinary perception filters out, not imagining things that weren't there. Noticing things that were there but that most people learn, through the progressive habituation of ordinary life, to ignore. This is the framework within which most modern researchers approach the case. The idea that extreme experience can temporarily or permanently alter the threshold of perceptual filtering, allowing a person to register stimuli that normal cognitive processes would dismiss as irrelevant, is not mystical. It is neurological. It is consistent with what we now know about how trauma and extreme experience can physically reshape the brain's attention and threat assessment systems. What Ansted could not account for, what he noted carefully and then placed in parentheses, as academics sometimes do with the things they most need to think about, was the nature of the original experience. The perceptual alteration in Cord was consistent, by Ansted's framework, with a severe and sustained novel stimulus, something that had bombarded his senses with information that his existing cognitive architecture could not categorize, could not file away, and therefore had simply rerouted, sending it to whatever overflow processing capacity the human mind possesses for experiences it cannot otherwise accommodate. In the margin of his notes, next to this section, Ansted wrote 3 words and then crossed them out. The crossing out is not heavy enough to obscure them. The words are, what was there? That question, what was there in that hollow on that December morning in 1908, is the question that the entire record orbits without ever entering. There is one final piece of evidence that was not discovered until 1955, and that has significantly reframed the case for every researcher who has encountered it since. In 1955, during a renovation of the Harlan County Courthouse, workers broke through a partition wall in what had been the county sheriff's storage room and found a small void space behind it that contained, among other things, several boxes of old records that had been apparently placed there sometime in the 1910s and then forgotten. Most of the records were routine, tax assessments, land surveys, minor criminal proceedings. One of the boxes, however, contained a sealed envelope labeled in a handwriting identified as George Priewitz, the original sheriff, as Cord E. Private, not for official file. Inside the envelope was a single folded sheet of paper. It contained a statement, handwritten, dated January 12, 1909, signed by Elias Cord. It was not witnessed. It had no legal standing. It was simply a statement, apparently given to Priewitz at some point after Cord began speaking again, and then sealed and stored rather than incorporated into the official record. The statement is brief. It runs to approximately 150 words. Most of it has been widely reported, and it confirms much of what Alcott later wrote about Cord's account of the hollow and the 24 observations. But there is one section of the statement, 4 sentences, that had not been reported before 1955 because it had not been in any file that anyone had previously examined. 4 sentences that Priewitz chose to seal away rather than include in any record that might be read. The statement reads, in the relevant portion, "I know that there is something in the hollow that was not put there by any man. I know that it has been there a long time. I know that it knew me before I came down the slope, and that it had reasons for what it showed me that I was not given to understand. I know that it will be there after everything else in this county is gone." 4 sentences, 104 years of silence around them. What Priewitz made of this statement, we do not know. He never referred to it in any other document. He died in 1931. Whatever he decided when he read those words from Elias Cord, whatever he chose to believe, whatever he was afraid to put in a file, he made his decision, and he kept it. Elias Cord died on March 3, 1941. He was 64 years old. The cause of death was listed as pneumonia, which was consistent with his symptoms over the preceding weeks. He died in his cabin, alone, which was how he had lived for most of his adult life. He was found by Dora Markham's son, who had been checking on him during his illness. The son, whose name was Thomas Markham, and who was then in his mid-30s, later described finding the cabin in the condition already mentioned, orderly, spare, and completely without papers. He also described something else, which he mentioned in passing in a letter to his sister, who had moved to Ohio, a letter that was later discovered in a family collection and brought to the attention of researchers in the 1970s. He said that when he found Cord's body, the man's eyes were open. He had been positioned, or had positioned himself, sitting upright against the headboard of his bed, facing east, facing the ridge. His hands were folded in his lap. Not in the supplication of prayer, but in the practical calm of a man who has finished what he was doing and is waiting for what comes next. Thomas Markham wrote, "He looked like a man who had been watching for something his whole life and had finally seen it arrive." This detail, like so many details in this story, is offered without interpretation by the man who observed it. He was not given to poetic license by all accounts. He was reporting what he saw. What was Elias Cord watching for in all those years of sitting on his porch before dawn, facing east, facing the ridge? What was in that hollow? What were the 24 things that he saw and would not describe and would not explain, because the describing of them would do to others what the seeing of them had done to him? What was in the papers that vanished? The pages covered in small, regular script in a language that the man who accidentally saw them could not identify. What did it mean? That it had been there a long time. That it had known him before he came down the slope. That it would be there after everything else was gone. These are not questions with answers in the existing record. They are questions that the record generates and then leaves, suspended, like the cold lamp in a surveyor's camp at the end of the second day, burning just long enough to show you the edge of the dark before it goes out. The hollow on the southern side of that eastern ridge in Harlan County, Kentucky, is still there. The ridge is still there. The town below it is quieter now than it was in 1908, diminished by the long decline that followed the coal boom and its collapse, but it is still there. Whatever Elias Cord found in that hollow in December of 1908 Whatever it was that fed him and kept him for 13 days and sent him back carrying knowledge he couldn't set down and couldn't share, left 24 things in the official record of a small Appalachian county, and not one of them has ever been satisfactorily explained. And somewhere in that, in the specific and stubborn silence at the center of this story, is the thing that matters most. Not the explanation, not the resolution, but the fact that a careful, steady, unremarkable man, a man who kept his word and didn't ask for more than he needed, came back from that hollow, permanently altered, permanently watchful, and permanently certain of something he would not tell another living soul. Whatever he saw down there, he died still seeing it. And the only question that remains, the one that has been waiting quietly at the bottom of this story since the beginning, is the same one that Dr. Anstead crossed out in the margin of his notes in 1927 and then could not stop thinking about for the rest of his life. What was there?